Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. Post-fight review, Johnny Fisher, Emilio Salas. Not much really to report on the fight itself because Salas took a dive in the first round. So Fisher was pressing forward, trying to land left hooks, also right hands, trying to bully his opponent, the first southpaw that he'd faced, and Salas just didn't like it. We'd seen Salas stop before a few times, most recently by Damien Kaneba at the end of last year on a top-ranked card, and he clearly didn't fancy it. A left hook, which was sort of cuffing, it didn't really land to the back of Salas's head, and he just meekly goes down. It was a dive. He complains to the ref that he was hit to the back of the head, but look, he ruffled his hair basically, and that's about it. He didn't like what he'd had earlier in the round and clearly wanted out, so he took a dive and was counted out. Really disappointing performance because this was the co-main event. So you had high hopes this is going to go some rounds. After all, Johnny Fisher heading into this one, 8-0. He needs rounds. He needs seasoning. This is not seasoning. It's not even salt. So you had Salas just not doing his job here. So really disappointing because, you know, as it was, Johnny Fisher was in that position of the co-main event because he's popular, he sells tickets. A lot of people turned up to that show to watch Salas take a dive, basically. So that's really why it's disappointing. But like I said on my Twitter, and I'll say it maybe here a little bit more eloquently, if you pay for poor opponents, expect a poor result. And that's what we got. Johnny Fisher is ready for better opponents. He's been ready for a while. And I think part of it is because he's still young. He's only 24 years old. You had a case after the Gabriel Nguema fight that they wanted just to slow things down because that went all 6 rounds. Fisher, was biting on feints. Nguema was using all the tricks that he had in his tool bag to just get Fisher to think. And he probably should have done better in that fight, and they decided, look, we need to slow things down. So effectively, for the best part of this past year and a bit, we've had pretty poor opposition that Fisher's been largely blasting out of there. So, a couple of things that we'll come to for the comments, because you had Eddie Hearn talking about the apprenticeship is over. But I would just sort of sum up and say, yeah, terrible opponent, and we got the result that they paid for, basically, because the opponent was never going to go many rounds, and it was probably even poorer than they expected. Mark Tibbs, in his sort of comments after the fight, said, look, I was disappointed because I was expecting some rounds. So, a waste of a camp. Johnny Fisher has had, 2 fights this year, and he's collectively gone 5 rounds, and we're halfway through the year. He needs to be fighting a bit more often and against slightly better opposition. But they did say that this was the last 8-rounder that Fisher would be in. But to be honest, he could be in more 8-rounders. They just need to get better fighters, better guys. Tony Bellew, who was on guest commentary spot for DAZN, suggested someone like a Kamil Sokolowski. And given that Fisher is now 9 fights deep, that's a totally appropriate fight. Even though he's still, relatively speaking, compared maybe to some of his peers like a Solomon Dakers, for example, quite raw, I think Fisher is at the time in his career where that's an appropriate fight, and Sokolowski's not going to buckle and fold, and if Fisher can go in there, get some rounds, he'll be the better for it. But Fisher himself, he talked about he was happy with the performance, that it was a good performance, that he was relaxed, and that, the first time a camp where he'd prepared for a southpaw but done 10 rounds back to back, and that he was still developing. And 2 years on from his debut, he doesn't see the pressure of the crowd. He sees it as a privilege. And following some comments from Eddie Hearn about the apprenticeship stuff, Fisher weighed in and said that he's passed my apprenticeship. And I kind of think it's way too premature to talk about that, because I don't think he has. Eddie Hearn went on to say that, it's time to rush a little bit and time to get really serious. And then he talked about going the traditional route, and then he talked about the Southern Area title. So the thing is, if you're dropping down to area title level, you're still in your apprenticeship phase. If he was maybe clearing the English title level, I'd kind of go, okay, well, they've got high hopes and they think he can move on to, British level and then European level. He's kind of past that first stage, that first bit of his prospect phase. I don't think he's really past his apprenticeship. I think he's still serving it, and that's seen in the level of opponents that they're giving him. That they think that this is the level that he can fight and get experience and beat right now. And it's been very careful matchmaking. So if he is to fight for an area title, I don't think that's, him having passed his apprenticeship. And actually Fisher said that, he's passed his apprenticeship, and he said A-star apprenticeship. I'm not so sure. He sells a lot of tickets, but he's still really raw, and I think they're still concerned about the level that they can match him at this point. As it was with this fight, the first southpaw, his feet position wasn't the greatest. I mean, at this level, with this level of opponent, he can be a bully boy. But when he stepped up to a slightly more durable opponent in Gabriel Nguema, who's got some, tricks in a tool bag to sort of help thwart him a bit, Fisher didn't really know how to cope at that time. Maybe he'd be better now. But I think someone like a Sokolowski, it's not a bad shout. But to sort of say that the apprenticeship is over, I'm not so sure. Sells a lot of tickets. This wasn't a co-main event, and the fact that there was a dive makes it even worse. So it's hard to take much from this, except to say that Fisher is still learning. And obviously we need to see more, but we need to see better opponents. Guys that can take a punch, that can go some rounds, and that can make him think and make him work, like the Nguema fight. If anything, they should have just continued with those sorts of fights, that level, and maybe even slightly above, to get him the rounds that he clearly needs. But I think they're stuck in that phase of his career where they're still trying to build his name, build the knockout reel, all that sort of stuff, get the hype behind him, because they don't want to have him having 4 or 5 fights in a row where he's not stopping a guy. But sometimes that could be more beneficial. Anyway, what'd you make of the fight? What'd you make of Emilio Salas and his dive? Disgraceful stuff. Drop a comment loud and often. Hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter. Boxing_squared. I'm out.